This tutorial is a project of nonprofitaccountingbasics.org, a free resource developed by the Greater Washington Society of CPAs Educational Foundation. Our goal is to encourage accuracy and accountability to help smaller nonprofits successfully manage and sustain their organizations.
We have previously discussed the significance of achieving the 1/3 fraction in order for a public charity to pass the support test under Section 509A1 and 509A2. We're now going to look at the mechanics of those two tests. For the 509A1 test, which is a little bit more well known, the numerator of this fraction includes donations and membership fees. And it's important to note that the membership fees we're talking about here are the ones that represent support and not ones for which the member has received some return benefit or value. And the numerator includes the value of free governmental services or facilities. Now there are some very significant subtractions in this numerator. You subtract from the total amount of support that you first thought you had received for purposes of this fraction, donations from any organization or any person other than public charities and governmental agencies that are in excess of 2% of your total support over a 5-year period. The effect of this subtraction is that for donations in excess of this 2% calculation that you've made over this 5-year period, only the 2% amount counts in the numerator. Let's work through an example. The total support for the 5-year period from 2010 to 2014 is $500,000. 2% of that amount is $10,000. Donations from individuals, taxable entities, and private foundations in excess of that $10,000 amount over the 5-year period do not count in the numerator. However, donations from public charities do count 100% of the numerator, which is an important thing to note. The denominator will include donations calculated in the numerator before this 2% subtraction, interest, dividends, rents, royalties, but not capital gains, unrelated business net income, and other income. There is a second alternative support test under 509A2, which is significantly different than this other test under 509A1. Under the 509A2 test, an organization that normally receives more than 1/3 of its support from contributions, membership fees, and gross receipts from related activities will pass as long as it also does not receive more than 1/3 of its support from gross investment income and UBTI, which is unrelated business taxable income, less taxes that it has to pay from businesses that it acquired after June 30, 1975. So this is a two-part test, a more than 1/3 test and a not more than 1/3 of support from gross investment income and UBTI. Let's take a look at the numerator for the 1/3 support. On line 1, you have donations and membership fees. The membership fees are for fees from members that are not in exchange for value. And then line 2 and line 3, which is gross receipts from admissions, merchandise sales, services performed, and other activities that are not unrelated businesses. So for example, museums and orchestras would have this kind of gross receipts revenue. There are some very significant subtractions to this 1/3 support numerator. Donations and receipts from disqualified persons is chief among them. Now, disqualified persons are going to be your board members, substantial contributors, officers, trustees, family members of those persons, and entities where those persons own more than 35% of the voting power or the profits interest, as well as owners of more than 20% of entities that are substantial contributors. So it's a very complicated definition, and it's important to note that this disqualified person definition is different from some of the other disqualified person definitions that you'll see in other code sections having to do with exempt organizations. There is another more than 1/3 support subtraction in the numerator. you have to subtract gross receipts in lines 2 and 3 that are not from disqualified persons, but ones that exceed the greater of $5,000 or 1% of total support in the denominator. Now let's take a look at the denominator of our fraction. You start with the total support in the numerator before any of the subtractions. You add to it line 10A, which is gross income from interest, dividends, rents, and royalties. Line 10B, which is unrelated business taxable income, less Section 511 taxes from businesses acquired after June 30, 1975. Net income from other unrelated business activities, and other income, but not capital gains. Now let's take a look at the second part of this 509A2 test. It's called the not more than 1/3 of support coming from gross investment income and UBTI. In the numerator of this 1/3 fraction, you have the total of lines 10A and 10B, and in the denominator you have total support. So it's fairly easy to calculate. With regard to the first test, the 509A1 test, there is a very significant alternate way in which you can still pass the 1/3 test if you do not actually achieve 1/3. So another way of saying that is, let's say you calculate on Schedule A that you do not achieve the 1/3 threshold. What are your alternatives here? And let's say you cannot achieve the 509A2 test, which we've just discussed. Well, there is something called the 10% facts and circumstances test. This test requires that your public support percentage be at least 10%, and I'll note that the closer that you are to 33 1/3%, the better. And the facts and circumstances are addressing the question, are you organized and operated so as to attract new and additional public or governmental support on a continuous basis? And if you look at the regulations and in the instructions to the Schedule A of the 990, you'll see that there are a lot of different ways in which the IRS phrases that question and points to different facts and circumstances that are significant and which you should pay attention to. Here are some of the factors. Do you have a continuous and bona fide program for solicitation of funds from the general public? Is the scope of your fundraising activities reasonable in light of your charitable activities? So this is kind of a weighing mechanism. Are you doing enough fundraising in light of what you actually plan on spending? Have you received your support from a representative number of persons and not just from a few donors? And this is something that you probably are not aware of unless you've gone back and looked to just see how many different donors that you have. And when you are describing to the IRS how you pass the facts and circumstances test, it's always a good thing to note exactly how many donors you've had over the 5-year period in question. You might be surprised at how large the number is. Do you have a governing body that represents the broad interests of the public? Now, this is often not the case, but it's important to note that Treasury regulations suggest, there's no requirement here, but they suggest that in order to pass this test, your board should include public officials, or perhaps persons selected by public officials, or persons having special knowledge in your field. So think professors, community leaders, clergymen, educators, civic leaders. If you can have those kinds of persons on your board, in addition to the great contributions that they're going to make by being on your board, it can be very useful in passing this test. Do you have a program to accomplish charitable work in your community? Do members of the public participate in your programs? Do you receive a significant portion of your funding from public charities or from the government? Taking a look at that second one that I just mentioned, do members of the public participate in your programs? I think if you went back and you looked at your programs, you would find that the numbers of people who do participate is quite large. And it's important to keep enough of your program material so that you can recalculate numbers like that. Now let's look at one other way in which you can perhaps circumvent the public support test by excluding certain grants from your fraction entirely. They do not appear in the numerator or the denominator. These are referred to in the regulations as unusual grants, and they mean essentially what they sound like. The definition that the regulations give us, and which are elaborated upon in the instructions to the Schedule 8 of the 990, tell us that you have to look at certain factors to determine whether you have unusual grants or not. Did you receive them from disinterested parties, i.e. people not on your board, people who have perhaps not given you donations in the past? Were these donations attracted by the public charity nature of your organization? Were they unusual or unexpected in amount? Were they so large that they caused you to fail the 1/3 test? Was the grant in a form that furthers your exempt purpose, such as a painting given to a museum? Has the public charity carried on a public solicitation program and been able to attract public support in the past? Which is to say, is this really an outlier? Is this really unusual? Because normally you don't need an unusual type grant, a large grant, in order to keep your operations going. Have you been passing the 1/3 test in the recent past? Then the regulations throw in a couple of factors that I will mention, but it's hard to weigh their significance because they sound a lot like the 10% facts and circumstances test. Does your charity have a representative governing body? It's really hard to link up that to the unusual grant characterization, but I'll just note it because it's in the regulations. And if you do, and you are trying to make an argument to the IRS that you have received an unusual grant, it's worth noting. And finally, and this one makes a lot of sense, does this donor who gave you this alleged unusual grant exercise any control over your organization directly or indirectly? As you might guess, if there is control, that's going to suggest that it's not an unusual grant. If the donor just came in out of the blue and really has no relationship to your organization, you have a much stronger case. Thank you.